Picture a house, right? But not just your average house. We're talking about a massive, sprawling structure, hidden corridors, rooms that literally haven't seen the light of day in years. Welcome to The Explainer. Today we are diving deep into a seriously chilling metaphor for the anxious, over-analytical mind. Because, so often, people who overthink, well, they're the architects of their own internal labyrinth. And the wildest part? Sometimes they lock the doors from the inside.
That room had been locked for 3 years. Just let the weight of that sentence hang in the air for a second. In the context of our source material, The Doll's Midnight Vigil, we aren't just talking about some physical space gathering dust. Psychologically speaking, this is all about the suppression of thought. When a highly analytical mind hits a trauma, or maybe an unresolvable anxiety, or even just a deeply uncomfortable truth, its go-to defense mechanism is usually to quarantine it. Just shut the door, turn the key, and walk away. 3 years of total isolation. 3 years of absolute, unbroken silence. Or at least that's how it seems on the surface.
Okay, let's dive into this and look at the actual psychology at play here. Because when we shift from that fictional locked room to the very real day-to-day reality of chronic overthinking, we find this fascinating parallel. People who think too much, they don't just passively experience their thoughts. No, they construct these heavy, impenetrable barriers around the ones they can't immediately solve. They literally create no-go zones in their own psyche. It's like they believe that by overanalyzing every single other thing in their lives, they can maintain total control and safely ignore that one locked door at the very end of the mental hallway. But as any psychologist will tell you, a thought suppressed is never a thought destroyed. It just changes form. It ferments. Look at how the suspense builds here, because it perfectly maps onto the timeline of anxiety. 3 years ago, the room gets locked. That's your initial suppression. Then comes the everyday reality. Nobody asks, nobody opens. And this right here is the real danger of a highly analytical mind. It is incredibly good at functioning normally on the outside. It builds this perfect routine of avoidance. The overthinker goes to work, socializes, smiles, completely ignoring that abandoned room. But then we hit that final point. Midnight, 12 a.m. A child's cry echoes from inside. The timing here is absolutely crucial. Because that pattern of isolation, it's ultimately unsustainable. You can ignore the room all you want during the noise of the day, but midnight always comes.
And that terrifying crying child at midnight concept, that is perhaps the most perfect metaphor I have ever seen for the inescapable, recurring thoughts of an overthinking mind. I mean, why midnight, right? Well, because midnight is when the external world finally shuts down. The daily distractions are gone. The emails stop. The screens go dark. And in that absolute silence, the baseline hum of an overactive mind just becomes deafening. That crying child isn't some monster. It represents vulnerable, completely unprocessed emotional pain. See, the analytical mind tries to solve emotions like they're math equations. And when it fails, it locks them away. But here's the thing. Emotions do not follow logic. They don't just stay quiet because you locked a door. They cry out when you're your most vulnerable, demanding to be felt.
One night, I gathered the courage. I opened the door. This right here, this is the critical juncture. Whether it's in therapy, deep self-reflection, or honestly sometimes just a moment of sheer emotional exhaustion, the overthinker finally breaks. The noise of that crying child, really, the sheer volume of that suppressed anxiety, it eventually becomes so much worse than the actual fear of what might be inside the room. But confronting our own deep-seated anxieties, that requires a monumental summoning of willpower. The protagonist of our story taking that terrifying step towards the door is the exact equivalent of an overthinker finally saying, okay, I'm going to unpack my deepest rumination. Now, what's really interesting about this progression is that it culminates in this entirely unexpected reality. Step 1 is finding the courage. Step 2 is opening that locked door. And step 3, finding the room completely, utterly empty. I really want you to think about the psychological profoundness of this. The overactive mind spends years, sometimes decades, absolutely terrified of the monster behind the door. It wastes immense, draining cognitive energy guarding a room that when you finally look inside holds no immediate, terrifying threat whatsoever. That massive, catastrophic failure you imagined? It's not there. The physical danger? Not there. The logical reality is just a void. The mind literally fabricated the urgency of that threat entirely on its own. And that brings us to the core concept of this whole explainer, the architecture of the overactive mind.
We're talking about an architecture that is incredibly complex, mostly because it's built on illusions that feel like solid concrete. The mind doesn't just invent vague, abstract fears, it constructs these vivid, visceral, physical manifestations of anxiety in completely empty spaces. It's actually this fascinating quirk of our brain's default mode network. Basically, when there's no immediate external problem to solve, the brain sometimes just invents one to keep busy. So an overthinker can walk into a totally neutral situation, like an empty room, a quiet relationship, a paused career, and their brain will instantly start building catastrophic architecture to fill up that space. The emptiness itself actually becomes the canvas for their anxiety.
But in one corner, there was a small doll. So the room wasn't entirely empty after all. When that grand, terrifying monster you expected isn't actually there, what you're left with is the subtle, highly unexpected residue of your fear. Just a small doll, left behind in the dark corners of the mind. In the psychology of chronic overthinking, this perfectly represents the inner child, or maybe the core trauma that was left frozen in time the exact moment that door was initially locked. It's small, it's quiet, it's incredibly easy to overlook if you aren't paying close attention, but make no mistake, it is undeniably there, just sitting quietly in the shadows of the psyche.
And this brilliantly illustrates the exact duality that plagues people who think way too much. On one hand, we have the empty room, right? This is the logical, observable reality. The overthinker looks around and says, logically, I am totally safe. Logically, there is nothing in here hurting me. But then, on the other hand, we have the small doll. This is the tangible, lingering emotional baggage, and the overthinker just cannot reconcile these two realities. They try so hard to use the cold, hard logic of the empty room to dismiss the existence of the doll. But here's the truth. You cannot logic away emotional residue. The anxiety sticks around. It occupies this tiny, seemingly insignificant little corner, and yet, it casts a massive, sweeping shadow over their entire reality.
There were tears on its face. Fresh tears. Think about that. The room has been locked for 3 years. The dust has settled. Time has completely stopped. And yet, the pain is current. The pain is happening right now. This is the ultimate, most chilling revelation about the overactive mind. The analytical brain firmly believes that by locking a problem away in the past, the problem just stays frozen in the past. But suppressed anxiety? It doesn't age. It doesn't dry up and blow away. The tears are fresh because the mind has been actively weeping in the dark that entire time. The overthinker is constantly, routinely re-traumatizing themselves through their very own internal subconscious architecture.
Which leads us to our final and definitely most vital question for this explainer. Does the overactive mind create its own ghosts? When we really look at the psychology we've unpacked today, we have to ask ourselves something. Are those fresh tears on the doll the supernatural manifestation of some haunting, or do they represent the very real, very fresh pain of an analytical mind that has successfully managed to trap itself? Because maybe, just maybe, the ghost isn't an external entity at all. Perhaps the ghost is really just our own echo bouncing off the walls of a room we locked ourselves, crying out for us to finally, truly, open the door and let the light in. So I'll leave you with this. What locked doors might you be guarding in your own mind tonight?